I have a confession to make. I'm sorry that I waited, that I deprived myself for so long from such an incredible movie. Please forgive me. Welcome back to The Haunted Beard, everybody. Thank you for joining me. I am continuing my Exorcist series of reviews, and today I'm talking about The Exorcist III. Yes, but before I get into it, listen, it is all horror and thriller movie content on my channel, so do not hit that subscribe button unless you want to be haunted by the beard. The Exorcist III tells the story of a police lieutenant who uncovers more than he bargained for as his investigation of a series of murders, which have all the hallmarks of the deceased Gemini serial killer, leads him to question the patience of a psychiatric ward. Now listen, I was excited about Exorcist III, and there was a handful of you who wrote in the comments on my Exorcist review video, wait till you watch Exorcist III, and you were hyping it up, and so I got my expectations, they were elevated, and I was looking forward to it. But the good news is you guys were not lying, as The Exorcist III, man, is quite a fun time, and I greatly enjoyed it. And listen, I knew about 2 minutes in, this thing was already vastly superior to anything from the god-awful Exorcist II. Right from the get-go, even over the opening credits, we just have some really nice atmosphere, some nice moody lighting, and there is this breathing that occurs over the credits with just this nice, creepy touch, and so I just knew we are off to a good start. Then we're introduced to our main protagonist, Lieutenant Kinderman, who is played by George C. Scott. And man, his performance in this is fantastic. I've seen a handful of Scott's other films, and so I was already a fan of his going into this. Movies like The Hustler from way back, Patton, The Changeling, which is, I think, kind of a hidden gem 80s horror film. Really good stuff. But George C. Scott is great, and he brings another awesome performance to his role as Lieutenant Kinderman. And he is this guy we learned very early on with his interactions and conversations with his friend, Father Dyer, that he is somebody who is not a man of faith. He's a very hardened man who has lived his life dealing with the evils and atrocities and violence of humanity, and is just very hardened and jaded because of it. And so the film does a really good job establishing his character, and we just get a really good sense of him early on. And he just feels like a real person. And just the looks he gives, the feelings in his eyes, he feels like a person who has actually done this for a living. And the friendship that is established between him and Father Dyer is also a real highlight of the film as well. They feel like real friends. And as I mentioned, there's a conversation that occurs early on where they're sitting down having lunch and they're just talking and they feel like real friends. And so one of the highlights for me in Exorcist III is just the character work, as just the characters here, I think, are just very well written, very well established, and the performances, I think, are just top notch. And I haven't even gotten to Brad Dourif yet, but don't worry, he's coming. Another one of the highlights of Exorcist III, I think, is in its subtlety and restraint. And I was pretty shocked at the lack of blood and gore throughout nearly the entire movie, as this has got to be the least bloodiest serial killer murder mystery movie I've ever seen, but not at all to the film's detriment. And the general rule of thumb for scriptwriting is typically show, don't tell. But Exorcist III does kind of the opposite of that, as they don't really show you anything from the crime scenes. You don't really see any of the dead bodies. Instead, George C. Scott describes, or some of his co-workers describe to him, the condition and the status in which the bodies were found. And so your mind just kind of fills all that in. And man, I found that approach just incredibly effective.
The killer drove an ingot into each of his eyes, then cut off his head.
The film also pulls way back, too, on its kind of portrayal of demonic activity. There's a scene that occurs early on in the movie where somebody is at the confessional confessing to a priest, and you hear just through the voice of this old woman, which you find out is something evil, but just through the voice and what they're saying, that's all you hear. You don't see any of it, but it's still just the restraint of it and the mystery of it is still just really effective.
All this bleeding.
And I found the way in which William Peter Blatty edited and shot the film to be really interesting as well. I was noticing during a lot of the conversations in the movie between any of the characters, oftentimes conversations are filmed where you'll have a shot that is kind of over the shoulder of one character and then the camera's facing the face of the other character, and it's kind of this two-shot. Well, Blatty doesn't really ever do that, and during the conversations, you basically just get a straightforward one-shot close-up of each person. And I just thought that was kind of interesting. I don't exactly know why he chose to shoot it that way, but it definitely stood out. There's some really interesting editing choices, too, where sometimes during scene transitions, or even within the scene itself, he'll just cut to like these insert shots, where he'll just insert images from typically the location where they're at into the film, sometimes to transition to the next scene, or sometimes just right in the middle of a scene itself. And I thought it just really stood out. I thought they were just interesting, creative choices that were just unique and different, and I thought it was really good. There's also this really interesting and kind of weird and bizarre dream sequence where Kinderman is at what I believe is a train station, and it's filled with angels and a bunch of people, and I would guess it's kind of like the waiting room where they are to be taken away to go to heaven, perhaps, but it's just kind of the right amount of weird to not totally like take you out of the movie, but I just kind of appreciated sort of the creative attempt of it, and I thought it just worked pretty good. It stood out, and I always like dream sequences because the rules just kind of go out the window and you just kind of get to, you know, go crazy with it. And so I thought the dream sequence here with the angels was pretty good. And then we get just a really, I think, great and powerful scene where, unfortunately, Father Dyer is the next victim. And we get the scene where Kinderman goes into his hospital bed and sees the body. And again, just it speaks to George C. Scott's performance here. His kind of restraint that he's holding back these tears is this very sort of emotional moment for him, but he's, trying to remain strong. I just found that to be a really powerful scene. Again, I can't say enough good things about George C. Scott's performance in this. He's just great. Not too long after this, Kinderman is taken into the maximum security psych ward, and we see a brief glimpse of a patient in a room in a straitjacket. And now this was my first time watching the movie, so I was not really at all familiar with the story. We see a glimpse of this patient in the room, and I wrote down in my notes, it's like, that looks like Father Karras. And so right there, my mind was like, okay, where in the world is this going? And so it was just this real unexpected moment in the movie that, as if I needed anything else to hook me in, it was just another hook that just reeled me right into this thing. And Exorcist III just does a really good job with the psychological and the element of mystery that it has. As we find out that this new killer has the same MO of the Gemini killer, who is dead. And so when you find out that just throws a twist in things. There's a scene that occurs not long after this that is just this very ominous scene where we see the lead doctor at this hospital. He is reading from this script. He's practicing this story to tell Kinderman, and we're not really sure why. And then Kinderman comes into his office, and he's got this little piece of paper in his desk that he's memorized and is reading from. And it's just this very sort of mysterious scene that we're like, what exactly is going on here? And so the film, I think, just nails the mysterious and just the ominous and creepy atmosphere. It just nails it. And then we find out that the prisoner in the padded room in the straitjacket is Father Karras, or at least it looks exactly like him. And so Kinderman gets to go into the cell and have a conversation with Father Karras, and then enter Brad freaking Dourif.
You must get them to do that, Lieutenant. It's important.
The Gemini is dead.
No, I am not! I'm alive!
And oh my goodness, the horror community is not worthy of Brad Dourif. Let me tell you, he really has two major scenes in this movie, and they are absolutely riveting. That opening scene where it starts off with Kinderman talking to Father Karras, and then in one edit, it goes from Karras to Brad Dourif, who's the Gemini killer. And his performance, I don't think I blinked through this entire scene. It is captivating. His performance is just amazing. What he does with his eyes, the different sort of vocal inflections that he does, man, it's just awesome. I can't say enough good things about Brad Dourif and his performance. Man, I was absolutely in love with Brad Dourif's performance in this movie.
Off comes the head without spilling one single drop of blood. Now, I call that showmanship, Lieutenant.
It was at this point that I started suspecting that the demon was perhaps kind of bouncing around and possessing or influencing multiple people. And then that suspicion was pretty much all but confirmed later on when Kinderman reads the passage out of the Bible of Jesus delivering the demon-possessed man, and the demon's name was Legion, and he said, "For we are many." And so that pretty much confirmed my suspicions. Now, I would be remiss if I did an entire review of The Exorcist III without talking about one of the most famous jump scares in the history of horror movies. Now, I have to be honest, even though this was my first time watching Exorcist III, I have seen this scene before, so I didn't get the full effect. But what I did get was seeing this scene within its larger context. Every time I had seen it before, I'd only seen the 10 seconds before it, and then the person coming out of the bedroom with the big old shears and cuts the girl's head off, right? But seeing it within the context of the film, it is a really well executed jump scare, and the buildup is excellent as it stays on that long wide shot down the hallway, and then it cuts to a shot with the nurse going into the first bedroom, and then it gives you a jump scare with the guy out of the bed, and so you kind of think, oh, okay, that must be it. It kind of lulls you into this false sense of security, then it cuts back to the long wide shot again, and it just takes its time. It's that slow burn buildup. Then she goes and checks the room, and it seems like everything's fine, so the last thing you'd possibly expect is somebody to come out of that room. And of course they do, and it's just a pretty phenomenal setup to a great jump scare. Now we get to the ending of the film, and I have another confession to make. So I did a poll asking people which version of the movie I should watch, the theatrical or the director's cut. And the director's cut got the most votes, so that's what I was going to watch. So then I go on Amazon, search for the movie, and I find The Exorcist III Legion, which is what I understand the director's cut was called. And I watched it. Well, after the movie ended, I did a little research on the comparison between the director's cut and the theatrical cut, and it turns out Amazon lied to me, and I actually watched the theatrical cut. Now, I did some digging and found out some of the major differences between the theatrical and the director's cut, and most of them are fairly minor until you get to the end of the film. Now, I can only comment on the theatrical because that's what I saw, although I did watch the ending of the film, the director's preferred version, afterwards. But what I saw was the theatrical cut. If I was to make any sort of criticism at all with Exorcist III, it would be with the ending. Now, by no means do I think it's bad. I don't even think it's average. I still think it's pretty good. It's just not quite at the level of the rest of the entire film. And the main reason is this, and I understand William Peter Blatty's main issue was that he really wanted this film to be devoid of any exorcisms. He didn't want it to be a typical Exorcist movie. He wanted it to just be called Legion. And he wanted the Exorcist title to be ditched altogether. And of course, the studio, when studios meddle in movies, usually the product is worse for it. So the studio made him film an exorcism scene. And here's the thing. It's a pretty well-directed scene. I like the effects. I think the fact that we do get a little bit of blood and gore is pretty cool. And I think it is well executed. It does feel a little out of place. It does feel a little forced. And it also feels a little bit rushed and a little bit hurried over. And so what ends up happening is George C. Scott is at home saving his daughter, and then a priest that we only see once previously in the movie, and he's mentioned once, kind of just randomly shows up and enters into Gemini Killer's cell to start this exorcism. And of course, all hell breaks loose. You get sort of this very theatrical, practical effects, and craziness happens, and he gets pinned to the wall and all that stuff. And then George C. Scott, Kinderman, shows back up, enters into the cell, and there's more of this kind of theatrical stuff. The floor gets lightning striked, and the floor falls away, and these people kind of come up out of the pit of hell, what looks like, and you see Karis there on the cross. And so then the priest, who you think is dead, kind of comes to, shows the crucifix to Gemini Killer and is speaking to Father Karras, you gotta fight it, you gotta fight it. And then Karras is able to just briefly override the Gemini Killer's possession long enough for Kinderman to shoot and kill Karras, thus kind of giving us this, at least to my understanding, giving Karras peace once and for all. Although, to me, it would still seem that the Gemini Killer would still be alive or would have the ability to transfer himself to another body still. I'm not entirely sure. But anyways, I still like the ending. I understand Blatty's complaints about it. The director's cut ending really just eliminates all the theatrics and really just has Kinderman go into the cell and shoot and kill the Gemini Killer, which to me is a little more kind of rushed and hurried than the one that we got. So, look, overall, I really, really liked Exorcist III. I think it is a really solid film. The ending isn't quite at the level of the rest of the film, but this is something that I still was pretty blown away by. I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to be like an 8, maybe even an 8.5 out of 10 for Exorcist III. So, yeah. Thank you so much for watching. I greatly do appreciate it. Up next is Exorcist The Beginning. It's going to be a first-time watch for me as well, so we'll see what happens, and I will see you next time on The Haunted Beard.